3 hours. 3 hours was all Thomas Edison needed to gather his associates, colleagues, and family over to watch a successful light bulb light up. The faces of everyone lit up, brighter than a bulb, as Edison finally hurdled over the struggles he'd been facing for the past few years. However, exactly 20 years earlier, the young Edison sat in a caboose on a train, hovering over his Bunsen burner, burning an experiment while on break from being a newsboy. As he stared at his chemicals reacting, the train lurched forward, throwing the Bunsen burner into the air, causing everything to come crashing down, including Edison's calmness. Flames quickly began to grow, and within seconds, the whole car was on fire. To put it simply, Edison quickly moved on from his job at the train company. Looking at Edison, that created the light bulb, and the Edison that burnt off the caboose of a train, it would seem like comparing two different people, two separate stories. However, Edison's story, like many inventors, creators, and entrepreneurs, find their lives and stories running down two different tracks: success and failure. Throughout his life, Edison was hurtling down both of these tracks, like when Edison would run from lab to lab, producing witnesses for his miracles, and sometimes riding the brakes, like during his vibrant and sometimes fiery experiments on the train, only to hit a dead end. As Edison puts it, many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. If this is the case, how come nearly 90% of startups and 75% of venture-backed startups today fail within the first 2 years, never to be started again? In many cases, Edison's life didn't take the two-track approach to success and failure. How could he create over 3,000 light bulb prototypes and test no fewer than 6,000 vegetable growths, ransacking the world for the most suitable filament material, only to say the 3001st experiment was the end of the line for the light bulb? This unrelenting pursuit of passion has given me much perspective on the role failure plays in our lives, all the way from our entrepreneurial spirit and drive at Stanford to how we overcome the biggest struggles in our own personal lives. This pursuit of utilizing failure, demonstrated by Edison, other makers, storytelling heroes, and even our own friends, is not something that seems like a natural thing to accept, but can be viewed as a stepping stone to our greatest successes. Failure, the thing we are taught to distance ourselves from, has to be one of the most overlooked parts of our maker's journey. What is this maker's journey, you might ask? By looking closely at the literature and studies behind failure, the historical feats and failures of successful people, and comparing those to the cyclical template of success and failure that is used in many of the most famous hero stories, we can see how the hero's journey can be overlaid onto our lives as makers to highlight how crucial failure is to our stories. In this presentation, I will lay out a detailed perspective of how failure plays a role in our successes by walking through the maker's journey with you. There are three key questions that I would like to dive into while making this journey. First, how have we traditionally learned to perceive and determine what failure is? In many ways, the way we have distributed and received praise and blame will influence our perspective on failure. Second, how does failure itself, the fear of failure itself, lead us into a corner and limit our future successes? And third, how does failure ultimately contribute to long-term learning and growth? All these ideas and perspectives will hopefully provide a new lens for us to analyze and think about failure. Let's start at the beginning of our maker's journey. In most cases, the patterns we develop for recognizing and treating failure form at the beginning of our lives. This is formed through observational learning, the principle that we are inherently conditioned to observe and imitate the actions of those around us. By observing the actions around us, we begin to understand the consequences linked to certain actions. Close your eyes and think back to the first time you rode a bike. What do you remember most? Watching your parents ride their bikes? Your first time without training wheels and probably crashing? Or your first solo down the street? For most people, the first thing is the crash and burn of your skin. The second thing is the cheers from your parents as you finish the ride down the street. These two experiences demonstrate the dichotomy of how we are conditioned to remember and repeat ourselves. In the case of biking, the most jarring memory of crashing trains your brain to, well, not crash anymore. The most fulfilling memory, the solo ride, helps us know what our goal is. Observational learning doesn't just end with watching our parents show us how to ride, but also exists when we reanalyze our own experiences with success and failure. This can happen when repeating the act, like the second time you ride a bike. These learning sessions can have a cumulative effect that slowly builds up how we perceive and act in our world, based on those previous self experiences. Throughout our lives, we have practiced observational learning and has undoubtedly applied bias on our views of failure. We see people fail all around us. The banana peel in the cartoons, the accident on the side of the road, and in almost all of these cases, we can see the immediate short-term aftermath applied to the situation and is almost always negative. Looking back on Edison, imagine if after his first attempt at the light bulb, he realized that the light bulb was failed and that darkness was always the destiny for the bulb. By the principle of our observational learning model built up in our heads, trying a failure again is going against our reinforced view of the prior experience. This all helps upbuild the first step of our maker's journey, breaking out of your comfort zone. By purposely trying to deny the risk and consequences of failure, we can have the freedom to experiment and pursue past the first failure. What once was the beginning of the end, is now just the end of the beginning. As we continue on our journey and go through life, it is simply inevitable that failure will come knocking at our door. In these cases, how do we not let the natural fear of failure limit us? How can we embrace the failure-first mentality that led Edison and others to persevere through their failures? Essentially, the fear of failure holds us back from approaching ideas with the willingness to accept failure. This prevents us from having the innovation and the risk tolerance to truly succeed. Take, for example, a recent study that delves into how semi-industrialized entrepreneurs are affected by the fear of failure. The city of Padang, Indonesia, a semi-urban community, has formed strong entrepreneurial roots due to its people's voluntary migratory patterns. However, their home rests on uneven ground. Over the past decade, the amount and intensity of earthquakes has deemed Padang to be inside a ring of fire. This phenomenon has been observed to be due to the inhabitation of people and arguably shaped entrepreneurial culture. With the perfect composition of local entrepreneurial culture and the unstoppable forces of nature countering each other, this community demonstrates a perfect sample of businesses developing with the fear of failure in mind. The objective of the study was to examine the relationship between the earthquake impact and preparedness, the fear of failure, the entrepreneur's well-being, and their financial performance. By selecting 120 business owners in Padang, the study sampled the owners by asking questions about business readiness, impact from disasters, and how resilient they found their communities after disaster. The results showed that entrepreneurs with a high standard of success are motivated by fear of failure. The entrepreneurs were observed to be using this concept as a way to become calculated risk takers in order to benefit from the prudence exhibited in their businesses. In fact, the study showed a higher fear of failure led to better financial performance. Resiliency also plays a significant role in the relationship between the fear of failure and well-being. Resiliency enables individuals to progress in difficult times when others are discouraged to face the challenges of business. For example, the study states that most of the business owners have experienced merantau, which is voluntary migration, and this has provided them with a new and challenging experience. Therefore, embedded challenges such as fear of failure and uncontrollable external factors such as past and future earthquakes did not reduce their well-being and consequently their entrepreneurial activities. All in all, having failure at the forefront of your mind helps businesses perform better, especially after being exposed to multiple roadblocks or failures. Lastly, to complete our maker's journey, we have to look beyond failure. To first do this, we have to see what failure has given us. Insight. The insight needed to analyze our failures and to take on future challenges with a greater wisdom. In many cases, school is also the first place that people experience failure on an individual level, and where they also have to learn past it. In the classroom, there are two main ways of teaching: direct instruction and productive failure. Direct instruction is where there is a lesson from the teacher, and then students set out to problem solve and do homework with this new material. However, productive failure, as Manu Kapoor, the creator of the term, puts it, places problem solving first, and then the instruction second. Students are then capable of understanding the gaps in their knowledge during lessons. This approach to teaching has been shown to increase retention of advanced concepts and give students further ability to not just learn concepts, but to master and use them. Consider this thought experiment. Imagine two kids coming home from school, excited that you just bought them a new toy. For the first child, you tell them the toy is yours, but first you must watch me play with it. You commence to play with the toy for a few minutes, then give it to the child. For the second child, you hand them the toy immediately and let them learn and figure out on their own. Which child did you think had the most fun and spent the most time with the toy? Probably the second child. The creative freedom gained from productive failure is the link between the maker product and their growth. Take another study done by Manu Kapoor as more real-world evidence of how productive failure creates a trail of learning after failure. This study exemplifies a productive failure. Engaging students in solving complex, ill-structured problems can be an exercise of failure. But put simply, groups of students were asked to solve physics problems, some of which were well-worded and almost spoon-fed to them, while others were ill-structured and difficult to understand. Of course, the groups with the ill-structured questions performed worse. These students outperformed their counterparts in the well-structured conditions on individual and near-far transfer measures subsequently, suggesting latent productivity in what initially seemed to be failure. The basis under which students thrive at these higher levels stems not from a perfect performance, but from the failure they embraced initially, and then the fast-paced, efficient learning that took place afterwards. So how are we able to utilize these lessons that we've experienced? Well, as makers, if we take a step back and pause and look at the bigger picture, it is unfair to judge a failure by your short-term initial perception of it. If we realize the amount of learning, lessons, resiliency, and preparedness we have gained for the future, it seems like failure is only a gift from our past selves. As we look back on Edison and follow his footsteps throughout his life, we see his apparent following of the maker's journey. Starting with just his passion as an inventor, he was able to persevere through many initial failures. He learned from those mistakes. And in one of his most famous quotes, he stated, "I have not failed, I've only found 10,000 ways that won't work." Leading with this kind of attitude left the world with so many of humankind's greatest achievements. When we overlay the maker's journey with Edison's life, we can see how the characteristics of Edison's life pointed to many lessons I discussed today. First, looking back at observational learning, we can see how our decisions are formed, especially about failure, about how flipping our perspective on failure being bad we can become more risk tolerant of failure. Secondly, the fear and respect of failure has been shown to bolster resiliency, develop and grow in businesses. And lastly, by reanalyzing our past failures, we can develop an intuition on how to succeed by learning.